There are moments when connection does not need words. No messages. No memories consciously recalled. No deliberate intention. And yet, someone thinks of you. Often at night. Jung understood that the psyche becomes most permeable when the ego relaxes. And night is when the defenses soften. During the day, the conscious mind dominates. Attention is fragmented. Identity is maintained through roles, tasks, and expectations. But at night, the unconscious takes the lead. This is when unresolved emotional material surfaces. Thoughts that appear uninvited. Images that arise without context. A sudden presence of someone who was not actively remembered. This does not happen randomly. Jung believed that emotional bonds do not exist only in consciousness. They exist in the unconscious field. When a connection has not been fully integrated, not understood, not resolved, not consciously released, it remains active beneath awareness. And the unconscious does not respect linear time. It does not distinguish between past and present, the way the conscious mind does. At night, when external stimulation fades, the psyche turns inward. What was suppressed during the day finds space to emerge. This is why certain people appear in the mind, precisely when one is alone with oneself. Not because of desire alone, not because of nostalgia, but because something remains unfinished. Jung called this psychic residue, an emotional imprint that continues to seek integration. The unconscious does not think in words. It thinks in symbols, sensations, and emotional charge. So when someone suddenly comes to mind at night, it is often not about the person as they are now. It is about what they represent internally. A mirror of vulnerability, a lost possibility, an unexpressed truth, a part of the self that awakened in their presence. This is why these thoughts feel different at night. They carry weight. They feel intimate. They are harder to dismiss. The ego is tired. The defenses are lowered. And the psyche speaks more freely. This does not mean the other person is consciously choosing to think of you. Most of the time they are not. The unconscious initiates the contact. Jung understood that emotional connections form unconscious bridges. These bridges are not mystical in the naive sense. They are psychological. When two psyches have interacted deeply, they leave traces in each other. And when one psyche enters a receptive state, those traces can activate spontaneously. Night creates that receptive state. The body relaxes. Control weakens. Awareness turns inward. And what has not been resolved moves closer to the surface. This is why night thoughts often feel honest, even uncomfortable. They bypass rational explanation. They do not ask permission. They simply appear. When these thoughts return night after night, Jung would not interpret this as coincidence. Repetition, for the psyche, is never accidental. It is a signal. The unconscious repeats what has not yet been integrated. This is why certain faces return in the dark. Not others. Not at random. The person who appears is often linked to an emotional threshold. A moment when something shifted internally. It may have been love that was never spoken. Conflict that was never resolved. Recognition that was never acknowledged. The unconscious holds onto these moments because they marked a change in the inner structure. Jung believed that when another person activates a deep inner process, they become symbolically charged. They no longer exist only as an external individual. They become an inner figure. And inner figures move freely at night. During waking hours, the ego keeps these figures at bay. It distracts itself. It rationalizes. It moves forward. But at night, the ego loosens. The psyche no longer needs to maintain a narrative. It seeks balance. This is when the inner figure returns, not to disturb, but to complete something. The mind may interpret this as longing or regret, but psychologically, it is unfinished integration. The unconscious is asking for recognition, not of the person, but of the part of the self that emerged in relation to them. This is why these thoughts often come with emotion rather than story. You may not think about specific events. You may simply feel their presence. A warmth, a heaviness, a subtle ache. Jung noted that emotions are the language of the unconscious. Where emotion appears without clear reason, meaning is close. At night, emotions are less defended against. The body feels more. The heart opens without instruction. This is also why some people feel that others are thinking of them. At the same time, not because of telepathy in the simplistic sense, but because shared emotional material remains active in both psyches. When two people carry the same unresolved charge, their unconscious rhythms can align. Night amplifies this alignment. Silence removes interference. The psyche becomes receptive, like a tuning fork responding to a familiar frequency. This does not require awareness. It requires resonance. Jung believed that resonance is what connects individuals most deeply. Not intention, not effort, but shared emotional truth. This is why, even after long periods of separation, someone can return to the mind with sudden clarity. Time does not dissolve emotional symbols. Only integration does. And integration does not always mean reunion. Often, it means understanding. Understanding what was awakened, what was projected, what was avoided. Until this understanding occurs, the unconscious will continue to bring the figure forward, not to pull you backward, but to invite completion. Night is simply when the invitation is easiest to hear, because the world is quiet, and the psyche is no longer distracted. When the psyche brings someone to mind at night, it is rarely asking you to return to them physically. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of unconscious connection. The unconscious does not think in terms of action. It thinks in terms of meaning. So when a person appears repeatedly in the quiet hours, the question is not, do I want to be with them again? But, what part of me is still alive there? Jung emphasized that the psyche uses people as symbols, when something essential could not be lived consciously at the time. A relationship may have ended, or never fully begun, but the psychological movement it initiated remains unfinished, and unfinished movements seek continuation. At night, the psyche reviews what the day suppresses. It does not replay events as they happened, but as they were felt. This is why nighttime thoughts feel different from memories. They are not nostalgic in the usual sense. They are not narrative. They are experiential. You may not remember what was said, but you remember how you felt in their presence. More alive, more vulnerable, more yourself, or perhaps more anxious, more exposed, more uncertain. Whatever state emerged around that person became associated with them internally. Jung would say that the person became a carrier of a psychic quality, and when the psyche needs to reconnect with that quality, the carrier returns. This explains why sometimes the thought is comforting, and other times disturbing. It depends on what aspect of yourself is being contacted. If the person represented authenticity, the psyche may bring them forward when you are drifting away from yourself. If they represented unresolved fear or abandonment, they may appear when similar emotional terrain is activated. Night removes the filters. There is no performance, no distraction, no immediate task to hide behind. The psyche speaks more directly. This is also why people often ask, why now? Why does this person appear years later, when life seems stable? Jung would answer, because stability allows deeper layers to surface. When survival pressure decreases, the psyche turns toward integration. What was postponed during struggle returns during calm. This does not mean something is wrong. On the contrary, it often means the psyche finally has space. The unconscious waits patiently. It does not demand attention immediately. It waits until the ego can tolerate truth. Night is when tolerance increases. Fatigue lowers resistance. Silence reduces interference. And the psyche moves toward completion. Completion does not always look like closure. Sometimes it looks like insight, a sudden understanding of why the connection mattered. why it hurt, why it could not continue, why it changed you. Jung believed that insight is the psyche's way of freeing trapped energy. Once something is understood, it no longer needs to repeat itself compulsively. This is why nighttime thoughts often fade after a period of genuine inner reflection. Not because you forced them away, but because they were heard. The unconscious does not cling. It communicates. And once communication is successful, it moves on. This is also why trying to suppress these thoughts often makes them stronger. Suppression tells the psyche that something important is being ignored, so it increases the signal. The figure appears more vividly. The emotion intensifies. Sleep becomes restless. Jung warned that what we resist inwardly gains autonomy, but what we approach with curiosity begins to integrate. Curiosity does not mean indulgence. It means attention without judgment. You notice the thought. You feel the emotion. You ask what it represents, rather than what it demands. This distinction is essential, because the unconscious is symbolic, not literal. It is not asking you to act. It is asking you to understand. At night, the psyche does not want solutions. It wants acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of loss, of desire, of fear, of growth. And growth often begins where something once mattered deeply. This is why the most emotionally significant figures are often those who never fully stayed. They left space behind. And space holds potential. Jung understood that the psyche develops not only through fulfillment, but through longing. Longing shapes depth. It forces reflection. It invites meaning. And at night, when the world no longer distracts, longing has room to speak. This does not mean you are meant to suffer endlessly. Longing that is understood transforms into direction. It shows you what you value, what you seek, what you must cultivate within yourself. Often, what you miss in another is something you are learning to embody. Presence, warmth, courage, truth. The psyche uses memory to guide development. So when someone thinks of you at night without realizing it, it is not because they are weak or unable to move on. It is because something meaningful was activated and has not yet been integrated. Night is when integration begins, because in darkness, the psyche is most honest. As this process continues, it becomes important to understand why the unconscious chooses the night specifically as its preferred moment of expression. Jung observed that consciousness is not constant. It fluctuates. During the day, consciousness is outward-facing. It is shaped by demand, role, and adaptation. You think in terms of usefulness, efficiency, and identity. At night, that structure loosens. The ego, which usually filters and organizes experience, grows tired. Its ability to repress weakens. And what has been waiting beneath awareness begins to rise. This is not regression. It is regulation. The psyche seeks balance between what is lived consciously and what remains unlived. When someone appears in your mind at night, it is often because something in your current life has activated the same inner configuration that once existed with them. The trigger may be subtle. A tone of voice you heard earlier, a moment of vulnerability, a quiet disappointment, a sense of closeness or distance. The conscious mind does not connect these dots. The unconscious does. Jung emphasized that the unconscious works through association, not logic. It links emotional states across time. So a feeling experienced today can awaken a figure from years ago, if that figure once held the same emotional charge. This is why the person who appears is not always the most recent or the most rational choice. They are the most symbolically resonant. The unconscious does not ask, "Who makes sense to think about?" It asks, "Who carries this feeling?" And at night, feelings are not suppressed by explanation. They move freely. This also explains why some people report that the presence feels almost physical. A heaviness in the chest, a warmth in the body, a sudden alertness before sleep. Jung would say that the psyche expresses itself somatically. When words are insufficient, the body becomes the messenger. This does not mean the person is sending energy consciously. It means the unconscious memory of connection is stored in the nervous system, and the nervous system responds automatically. Night quiets the mind, but it amplifies sensation. The psyche takes advantage of this. This is also why dreams often follow these thoughts. Dreams are the unconscious continuing the conversation. In its native language, images replace concepts. Movement replaces explanation. If the person appears in dreams, it is rarely about them as they are. It is about what they symbolize now. Jung warned against interpreting dreams literally. Literal interpretation traps meaning. Symbolic interpretation releases it. The same applies to nighttime thoughts. The danger is not thinking of someone at night. The danger is mistaking symbol for instruction. Many people believe that if someone appears in their mind repeatedly, it means they should act, reach out, reignite, return. But the unconscious is not issuing commands. It is presenting material. Material for reflection, for differentiation, for integration. Acting prematurely can interrupt this process, because action seeks resolution, while the unconscious seeks understanding. Understanding takes time. This is why these thoughts often fade. Once clarity emerges internally, even if nothing external changes, the psyche recognizes that its message was received. Jung believed that when unconscious material is integrated, it no longer needs to announce itself emotionally. It becomes part of the personality. This is the difference between being haunted and being informed. Haunting feels intrusive. Informing feels quiet. At night, before integration, the thought feels intrusive. After integration, the memory remains without charge. You can think of the person without being pulled. That is the sign of completion. Completion does not erase importance. It transforms it. The person no longer holds you. The meaning they carried now belongs to you. This is psychological maturity. It is also why the thought may shift over time. At first, it is emotional. Later, it becomes reflective. Eventually, it becomes neutral. Each stage indicates progress. Jung stressed that neutrality is not indifference. It is integration. What is integrated no longer needs intensity. This is why the psyche does not rush the process. It unfolds at the pace of readiness. Night simply offers the conditions where readiness can be tested. Silence, stillness, reduced distraction. In these conditions, the unconscious can finally speak clearly. And clarity, once achieved, changes how you relate to memory, connection, and even absence. You no longer ask, "Why am I thinking of them?" You ask, "What in me is becoming visible now?" This question shifts power inward. It transforms the experience from something happening to you into something happening through you. And that shift is exactly what the unconscious has been working toward all along. As this inward shift deepens, the psyche begins to reorganize itself in subtle ways that are easy to overlook if you are only watching the surface of your life. Jung often spoke about the psyche as a self-regulating system. It does not simply release memories for nostalgia. It releases them when a new inner position is forming. This is why nighttime thoughts of a specific person often appear during periods of transition. Not necessarily external change, but inner movement. You may not yet know what is changing. You may only feel restlessness, a quiet dissatisfaction, a sense that something no longer fits. The unconscious detects this before the conscious mind does. It reaches back to figures who once represented a threshold. People who were present when you crossed from one inner state to another. People who saw you becoming someone new, even if briefly. They are remembered not because of who they were, but because of who you were with them. Jung emphasized that relationships often act as mirrors for latent potentials. Certain qualities in you awaken only in certain relational fields. Confidence, vulnerability, creativity, tenderness, strength. When the psyche senses that these qualities are needed again, it may summon the image of the person through whom they were first experienced. This does not mean the person is the source. It means they were the doorway. The psyche remembers doorways. At night, when roles dissolve, the psyche is free to revisit them. This is also why the emotional tone of these thoughts can change over time. At first, there may be longing, then confusion, then insight. Each emotional shift reflects a different stage of integration. Longing indicates projection. Confusion indicates differentiation. Insight indicates reclaiming. Jung described projection as the psyche placing its own contents onto an external figure because it cannot yet hold them itself. Nighttime is when projection is most visible, because defenses are lowest. But projection is not a failure. It is a developmental stage. Once you recognize what you have projected, you can take it back. Not forcefully, not intellectually, but gradually, through awareness. This is why the unconscious repeats the image. Not to torment you, but to give you enough exposure to recognize what truly belongs to you. The moment you see it, the repetition begins to weaken. The person loses symbolic power, and something else happens. Your attention turns inward, not as withdrawal, but as ownership. You begin to feel whole, without needing the external figure to complete the experience. This is individuation, Jung's central concept. Individuation is not isolation. It is the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you have been reacting as. Night thoughts are often the psyche's way of nudging you toward this process. They ask you to sit with feeling, without rushing to solve it. They ask you to tolerate ambiguity, long enough for meaning to emerge. Modern culture often treats lingering thoughts as signs of weakness or obsession. Jung would disagree. He would say that unresolved psychic material demands patience, not suppression. What you resist persists. What you observe transforms. This is why trying to stop thinking about someone rarely works. Resistance adds energy. Observation removes it. At night, you are given the opportunity to observe without interference. No one is watching. Nothing is required. Just awareness. And awareness, when sustained, is inherently transformative. Over time, something unexpected occurs. The thought no longer arrives with urgency. It arrives calmly. You notice it, and it passes, not because you forced it away, but because it has delivered its message. Jung believed that the unconscious stops speaking loudly. Once it feels heard, silence returns, not as emptiness, but as completion. And in that silence, new space opens. Space for new connections, new symbols, new stages of selfhood. The psyche moves forward, carrying the integrated past within it, no longer needing to revisit it compulsively. Night then becomes restful again, not because nothing is happening inside, but because what is happening no longer needs to announce itself through longing. It has become part of you. As this integration settles, the psyche begins to express itself with greater subtlety rather than intensity. Jung noted that before a pattern dissolves, it often becomes clearer. Not louder, but more precise. You may begin to notice when the nighttime thoughts arise. Not randomly, but following specific inner states. Moments of emotional honesty. Moments of self-respect. Moments when you choose yourself quietly. Paradoxically, the thought of the other person may surface not when you feel weak, but when you are becoming stronger. This is because the unconscious compares who you are now with who you were when the symbol first formed. It measures distance, and distance creates awareness. The psyche asks, do you still need this image to access that part of yourself? Often, the answer is no. But the psyche does not remove symbols abruptly. It tests. It brings the image back, to see whether it still grips you, or whether it now passes through you. At night, this test is most accurate. There is no performance, No social self. No narrative. Only your nervous system responding honestly. If the body no longer tightens, if the emotion no longer spikes, the psyche registers progress. This is why the same thought can feel different across nights. One night it carries weight. Another night it feels distant. Another night it barely appears. These fluctuations are not setbacks. They are calibration. Jung believed the psyche adjusts gradually. To avoid destabilization, rapid detachment can be just as defensive as clinging. True integration is slow, quiet, and stable. Another important aspect Jung emphasized is that unresolved inner figures often carry future-oriented meaning. They are not only about what was lost, but about what is being prepared. The psyche does not simply revisit old material for reflection. It also uses it to shape readiness. The qualities symbolized by the person may be required in an upcoming phase of life. Depth, presence, emotional openness, discernment. By revisiting the symbol, the psyche strengthens these qualities internally before they are needed externally. This is why after integration, new relationships often feel different. Not dramatic, not intoxicating, but grounded. You recognize emotional patterns quickly. You respond instead of react. You choose rather than chase. Jung would say that when projection has been withdrawn, perception becomes clearer. You see people as they are, not as carriers of missing parts. Nighttime thoughts lose their urgency, because urgency belongs to unmet inner need. When the need is met internally, the psyche relaxes. But until then, it continues its work patiently. It does not judge. It does not rush. It simply repeats what has not yet found its place. This repetition is not punishment. It is instruction. And the instruction is always personal. No two people carry the same symbols in the same way. This is why comparison fails in psychological work. Your psyche speaks in your language, through your memories, through your figures. At night, this language becomes audible, not because the night is mystical, but because the noise of the day subsides. And in that quiet, what has been forming beneath consciousness finally has room to move. The thought arrives. You notice it. You feel it. Jung observed that the unconscious does not only bring back people who mattered emotionally. It brings back positions you once occupied in relation to them. You may notice that when the image arises, it is not always accompanied by the same version of yourself. Sometimes you feel smaller, sometimes more open, sometimes strangely calm, sometimes alert, almost watchful. These shifts are significant. They show that the unconscious is not replaying memory. It is examining identity. Who were you then? Who are you now? And who are you becoming? Nighttime is when these comparisons can occur without distortion. During the day, identity is reinforced by habit. At night, habit loosens. The psyche takes advantage of this looseness to test new inner postures. This is why you may respond differently to the same image over time. The person remains the same symbol, but your position changes. Jung believed that growth becomes visible, not when symbols disappear, but when your relationship to them changes. If the image appears, and you no longer seek something from it, the psyche notes this. If the image appears, and you feel compassion rather than longing, the psyche notes this. If the image appears, and you feel nothing but clarity, the psyche understands that a cycle is closing. But closure, in Jungian psychology, is not an ending. It is a reorganization. The psychic energy once bound to the symbol is released back into the personality. This energy does not vanish. It becomes available. You may feel it as increased self-trust, as emotional steadiness, as the ability to be alone without contraction. These changes often go unnoticed at first, because they lack drama. Jung warned that the psyche prefers quiet transformations. Loud change is often compensatory. Real change is subtle. This is why people sometimes say, I don't know when it happened, but I feel different. The unconscious completed its work. Without announcing it. Night thoughts often diminish around this time. Not abruptly. They thin. They lose narrative. They lose emotional charge. They may appear briefly, like a passing shadow, and then dissolve. This is not repression. It is resolution. The psyche no longer needs the symbol to access what it once guarded. What was externalized has been internalized, and something else begins to happen. Your attention turns toward the present. With greater ease. You are less pulled by memory, less anxious about outcome. This is because psychic energy is no longer trapped in unfinished loops. Jung described this state as increased psychic economy. Less effort is required to be yourself. Night becomes restful again, not because the unconscious has gone silent, but because it is no longer carrying unresolved tension. It continues working, but now on future-oriented material. Preparation rather than repair. This is when dreams may shift in tone. Less repetition. More movement. More unfamiliar symbols. The psyche signals readiness. Not readiness for action, but readiness for expansion. And all of this began, not with forcing clarity, but with allowing the night to speak in its own language. Quietly, patiently, persistently. The unconscious does not demand obedience. It asks for attention. And attention, sustained over time, is what allows meaning to finish forming. And this is where the meaning completes itself. Jung believed that when the unconscious has finished communicating, it does not leave you with answers, but with orientation. You do not suddenly know everything. You simply stop being pulled in the wrong directions. The nights grow quieter. Not empty, but settled. What once appeared as a person reveals itself as a process. What felt like longing reveals itself as integration. What seemed mysterious reveals itself as necessary. The psyche does not bring someone to your mind at night to disturb your peace. It does so to restore balance. When the lesson has been absorbed, the image releases you, and you do not notice the moment it happens. You notice it later, when you realize you are no longer waiting, no longer searching, no longer circling the same emotional ground. This is how the unconscious heals. Without spectacle, without force, without explanation. It completes its work by returning energy to where it belongs, your present life. And when this happens, you do not feel triumphant. You feel grounded. This grounding is the sign. It means the psyche has reorganized itself around wholeness rather than lack. Carl Jung understood that this is not an ending, but a maturation. The mind no longer needs to call someone back at night, because what they represented now lives within you. And from this point forward, your attention becomes freer, your presence deeper, and your inner world quieter. Not because it is empty, but because it is finally in dialogue with itself.